Montana Territory, 1878. Wind whistled through the ponderosa pines as a lone rider approached the small mining town of Silver Creek. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street, where wooden storefronts stood shoulder to shoulder like soldiers awaiting inspection. Franklin Reed sat tall in his saddle, his 24-year-old frame lean and hardened from years working cattle. His blue eyes squinted against the setting sun as he surveyed the town ahead, a place that represented both opportunity and uncertainty. Franklin adjusted his hat, a well-worn Stetson that had seen its share of rain and sun. Unlike many of the rough men who populated these frontier towns, he kept himself relatively clean-shaven, with only a day's worth of light stubble shadowing his jaw. His hands, calloused from rope and reins, held the leather with a practiced ease that spoke of a life spent in the saddle. As his horse plodded down the main street, Franklin couldn't help but feel the familiar tightness in his chest, that wariness that had kept him alive these past years. The frontier was no place for letting your guard down. He'd learned that lesson early, watching his father die defending their small Texas homestead when Franklin was just 16. In the 8 years since, he drifted from ranch to ranch, never staying long enough to form attachments. Attachments meant vulnerability, and vulnerability got men killed out here where law was as thin as the mountain air. No sense in putting down roots in shifting sand, his father had told him once. Those words had become Franklin's creed after burying the only family he'd ever known. The lesson had been reinforced time and again as he witnessed the harsh reality of frontier life: good men broken by drought, women widowed by violence, children orphaned by disease. Franklin had decided long ago that he would face this brutal land alone. It was simpler that way, safer. What Franklin wanted was straightforward enough: to earn enough money driving cattle to buy his own small spread someday, a place where he answered to no one, where he could live by his own rules. What he told himself he didn't need was the complications of friendship or, worse yet, love. Love was a luxury for those in safer places, for men who didn't have to worry about outlaws or Indians or the thousand natural dangers of the untamed West. As Franklin tied his horse outside the Silver Dollar Saloon, he ran a hand through his sandy brown hair, brushing away the dust of the trail. He needed information about potential work, and saloons were where news and opportunities flowed as freely as the whiskey. The saloon's interior was dim and smoky, the air thick with tobacco and unwashed bodies. Men hunched over card games or nursed drinks at small tables. Franklin made his way to the bar, ordered whiskey, and listened to the conversations around him. Word was the Diamond D Ranch was hiring hands for a cattle drive north to the railroad at Helena. Good pay for 6 weeks of hard work, just what he was looking for. "They're taking on men at first light tomorrow," a grizzled miner informed him. "Foreman's name is Donovan, tough but fair, they say." Franklin nodded his thanks and finished his drink, already planning to be at the Diamond D at dawn. As he turned to leave, the saloon doors swung open, bringing with them a gust of fresh air and the most striking young woman Franklin had ever seen. She was perhaps 20 years old, with hair the color of sun-drenched wheat that fell in waves past her shoulders. Unlike the painted ladies who worked the saloon, she wore a simple blue dress with a white collar, modest yet unable to hide her natural grace. What struck Franklin most, however, were her eyes, bright green and alert, taking in the saloon with neither fear nor naivety, but with the clear gaze of someone who understood exactly where she was. The room quieted momentarily as several men straightened their postures and removed their hats. The woman seemed unbothered by the attention as she scanned the faces until her eyes landed on an older gentleman in the corner. "Uncle Thomas," she called, her voice clear and confident. "Father sent me to fetch you. The stage from Helena has arrived with those supplies you've been waiting for." The older man stood, gathering his hat and coat. "Coming, Willow. Tell your father I'll be right along." Willow, the name suited her, Franklin thought, strong yet graceful. As she turned to leave, her gaze briefly met Franklin's. Something passed between them in that moment, a spark of recognition though they'd never met. Franklin felt an unfamiliar tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with his usual wariness. Then she was gone, leaving only the lingering scent of lavender in her wake and a strange, unsettled feeling in Franklin's usually well-ordered mind. Franklin spent that night in the modest boarding house at the edge of town, but sleep eluded him. Instead of dreaming of cattle and open ranges, his mind kept returning to green eyes and wheat blonde hair. Annoyed with himself, he rose before dawn and prepared to head to the Diamond D Ranch. Whatever momentary distraction the young woman had caused would surely fade once he was back to the familiar rhythm of ranch work. The Diamond D sprawled across a fertile valley 10 miles outside Silver Creek. As Franklin approached the main house, he noted the well-maintained corrals and sturdy outbuildings, signs of a prosperous operation. A dozen or so men already waited near the bunkhouse, some familiar faces from other outfits, others strangers. The foreman, Donovan, was a barrel-chested man with a salt-and-pepper beard and eyes that missed nothing. He questioned each man about his experience before accepting or rejecting them for the drive. When Franklin's turn came, his years of experience spoke for themselves. "Read A," Donovan said, making a note in a small book. "Can you start today? We're gathering cattle from the north pasture." "Yes, sir," Franklin replied. "That's why I'm here." "Good, find Hank by the corral. He'll assign you a horse." Franklin turned to go when Donovan added, "Owner wants to meet all the new hands at supper tonight. Mr. Dawson likes to know who's working for him." Franklin nodded and headed toward the corrals. He preferred employers who kept their distance, but it was a small price to pay for steady work. The morning passed quickly as he joined the other hands in bringing in cattle from the outlying pastures. Franklin found comfort in the familiar work, the rhythm of horse and rider moving as one, the skill of turning a stubborn steer, the unspoken coordination between experienced cowboys. It was mid-afternoon when Franklin caught sight of a rider approaching from the direction of town. The sun silhouetted the figure at first, but as the horse drew closer, Franklin felt that same strange tightness in his chest. The rider was Willow, her blonde hair now braided and tucked beneath a practical hat, her blue dress replaced by a sensible riding skirt and blouse. She rode astride like someone born to the saddle, controlling her spirited bay mare with subtle movements. She passed near where Franklin was working, offering a brief nod before continuing toward the main house. One of the older hands noticed Franklin's gaze following her. "That's the boss's daughter," the man said, "Willow Dawson. Just finished schooling back east somewhere. Smart as a whip and knows this ranch better than most men who have worked here for years." "Dawson," Franklin repeated, the significance sinking in. She wasn't just any rancher's daughter, she was his new employer's daughter. Yep, old man Dawson dotes on her something fierce since her mother passed, sent her east for education but couldn't bear to have her stay there. She helps run the books for the ranch now. Franklin nodded, filing away this information while reminding himself it made no difference to him. He was here to work cattle, not to notice green-eyed ranch daughters, no matter how striking they might be. That evening, the hands gathered in the large ranch house dining room. James Dawson was a tall man with the same wheat-blonde hair as his daughter, though his was streaked with gray. His weathered face spoke of years under the Montana sun, but his eyes remained sharp and assessing as he greeted each new hand. "Welcome to the Diamond D," Dawson said when he reached Franklin. "Donovan says you've got good experience." "Yes, sir," Franklin replied. "Been working cattle since I could sit a horse." "Good, we need reliable men." Dawson paused, studying Franklin more carefully. "Reed, is it? You look familiar somehow." Before Franklin could respond, Willow entered the room carrying a large pot of stew. All conversation paused as she set it on the table before taking her place at her father's right hand. She wore a simple green dress that matched her eyes, her hair now loose around her shoulders. When her gaze met Franklin's, there was a flicker of recognition. "Miss Dawson," Franklin acknowledged with a slight nod. "Mr. Reed," she replied, surprising him that she'd remembered his name from Donovan's introductions. "I believe I saw you in town yesterday." "Yes, ma'am, at the Silver Dollar." Her lips quirked slightly. "Not a usual haunt for young ladies, I know. Uncle Thomas forgets the time when he's playing cards." The meal progressed with talk of the upcoming drive, the condition of the cattle, and the best routes north. Franklin found himself repeatedly glancing toward Willow, who participated in the conversation with knowledge that impressed even the veteran hands. She wasn't merely a rancher's pampered daughter, but someone who understood the business in detail. As the men filed out after dinner, headed for the bunkhouse, Franklin found himself walking alongside Donovan. "Miss Dawson seems to know her way around ranch business," Franklin observed. Donovan nodded. "Her father's been grooming her to take over someday. Some of the neighboring ranchers thought he was crazy, educating a daughter like she was a son, but she's got a head for figures and cattle both." He gave Franklin a sidelong glance. "She's also the boss's daughter, Reed, best remember that." I've got no intentions beyond doing my job, Franklin said firmly, irked that Donovan would suggest otherwise. Good, the foreman replied. Because James Dawson is protective of his only child, and he's got no patience for drifters with wandering eyes. The warning was unnecessary. Franklin had long ago decided that his path didn't include the complications of romance. Still, as he settled into his bunk that night, he couldn't help but recall the intelligence in those green eyes and the quiet confidence with which Willow had discussed ranch matters. She was different from other women he'd encountered on the frontier, neither a fragile eastern flower nor a hardened frontier survivor, but something altogether unique. The next morning brought gray skies and a steady drizzle that turned the ranch yard to mud. The hands worked through the weather, bringing in more cattle from distant pastures and beginning the process of separating out those destined for the drive. Franklin found himself assigned to a remote section of the ranch, working alongside a taciturn hand named Charlie to gather strays from a wooded valley. They had just finished lunch under the shelter of a large pine when the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention. To Franklin's surprise, it was Willow, dressed in oilskin and riding confidently through the rain. "Charlie, father needs you back at the main corral," she announced. "The new bull is giving them fits, and you're the best with the difficult ones." Charlie nodded, gathering his gear. "What about the rest of these strays, Miss Willow?" "I'll help Mr. Reed finish up here," she replied, dismounting. "I know this valley better than most anyway." Charlie looked uncertainly at Franklin, then back at Willow. "Your father won't like you being out here alone with a new hand, miss." Willow's chin lifted slightly. "I'm hardly alone. We're on Diamond D land with ranch hands in every direction, and I've been riding these hills since before I could walk. Besides, I'm carrying this." She patted a small revolver holstered at her waist. "Now go on before that bull does more damage." After Charlie reluctantly departed, an awkward silence fell between them. Franklin busied himself checking his saddle rigging, unsure how to proceed with the boss's daughter, now his only company. "You don't talk much, do you, Mr. Reed?" Willow finally said, swinging back onto her horse. "Never found much need for extra words, Miss Dawson," he replied. A smile played at her lips, a quality my father would appreciate. "He says most men use 10 words when 2 would suffice." She pointed toward a narrow draw to the east. "There's a small meadow up that way where strays often gather. Shall we?" They rode side by side where the trail allowed, Willow occasionally pointing out landmarks or sharing tidbits about the ranch's history. Despite his initial discomfort, Franklin found her easy to talk with. She asked intelligent questions about his previous work and listened attentively to his answers without the pretense or flirtation he might have expected from a young woman. "How long have you been drifting, Mr. Reed?" she asked as they rounded up 3 steers from the meadow she'd mentioned. "Most of my life," he admitted, "and it's Franklin if you don't mind." "Franklin," she repeated, as if testing the name. "Then you must call me Willow, at least when we're not in company. Miss Dawson makes me feel like a schoolteacher." She skillfully turned a steer back toward the main herd. "So why the drifting?" "Most men eventually find somewhere to settle." Franklin was surprised by her directness. The frontier's not a place that encourages putting down roots, too unpredictable. "Yet my father has built something lasting here," she countered. "As have many others." "At what cost?" The question slipped out before he could consider it. Willow studied him thoughtfully. "A fair point. We've had our share of hardships, drought, harsh winters, trouble with rustlers. Lost my mother to fever when I was 12. Her voice softened at this last part. "But I'd argue the roots we've put down have helped us weather those storms, not made us more vulnerable to them." Her words challenged the belief Franklin had held since his father's death. That attachment was a liability in this harsh land. Before he could formulate a response, the sky opened up in a deluge that had them both spurring their horses toward a lined shack visible in the distance. They reached the small cabin just as thunder rumbled overhead. It was a simple one-room structure with a small stove, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, and a narrow cot against one wall. Willow busied herself starting a fire in the stove while Franklin saw to the horses, securing them beneath the shack's small overhang. When he returned, shaking water from his hat, the cabin had taken on a warm glow from the crackling fire. Willow had removed her oilskin coat to reveal a practical riding outfit that somehow managed to be both modest and flattering. "This storm won't let up soon," she said, looking out the single small window, We might as well get comfortable. She gestured to the pot on the stove. I've put on coffee. Franklin remained near the door, acutely aware that being alone with the boss's daughter in such close quarters could be misconstrued. Willow seemed to read his thoughts. Don't worry, Franklin. My reputation won't suffer from taking shelter during a storm with one of my father's hands. I'm known for having more sense than sentimentality. Her frankness startled a laugh from him. That's reassuring, though not exactly flattering to me. She smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her face from merely pretty to truly beautiful. I didn't mean it that way. I only meant that people here know me too well to gossip about something so innocent. She poured coffee into 2 tin cups. Besides, we're hardly strangers now. I know you were born in Texas, have worked cattle across 3 territories, and can spot a stray at distances that impress even Charlie, who claims to have eyes like a hawk. Franklin accepted the coffee, surprised she had retained such details from their brief conversations. And I know you can ride as well as any hand on this ranch, keep books that would befuddle most bankers, and have a habit of rescuing your card-playing uncle from saloons. A fair exchange of information, she said, gesturing for him to take a seat at the small table. Though I think you're still keeping the most interesting parts of your story to yourself. Outside, rain pounded on the roof as they sipped their coffee. Franklin found himself sharing more than he had intended, about growing up on a small Texas ranch, losing his father to raiders, and his years of drifting afterward. Willow listened intently, asking questions that showed genuine interest rather than mere politeness. In turn, she told him about her childhood on the Diamond D, her years at a Boston boarding school, and her return to Montana with dreams of expanding the ranch her father had built. Father wants me to marry one of the neighboring ranchers' sons, she confided, a hint of frustration in her voice. Join the properties and create the largest spread in the territory. A sound business decision, he calls it. And what do you call it? Franklin asked. A prison sentence, she replied bluntly. Richard Thornton may know cattle, but he sees me as little more than a convenient way to acquire our water rights. And he's the best of the options. She stared into her coffee. I've told Father I won't be traded like prized breeding stock. I want what my parents had. They genuinely loved each other. Franklin found himself admiring her determination. What does your father say to that? He gives me the same speech about frontier realities and how rare true love is out here. She looked up, her green eyes holding his. But I've seen enough of life to know when something's worth waiting for. There was something in the way she said it, something in her direct gaze, that made Franklin's heart beat faster. He looked away first, uncomfortable with the unfamiliar feelings stirring within him. The rain's letting up, he said, rising to check the window. We should get those strays back before dark. If Willow was disappointed by his retreat, she didn't show it. She simply gathered her things and prepared to ride out again. As they worked together throughout the afternoon, gathering the remaining cattle, Franklin found himself watching her more than was strictly necessary. There was a grace to her movements, a competence that he found unexpectedly attractive. More dangerously, he found himself enjoying her company in a way he hadn't enjoyed anyone's in years. By the time they returned to the main ranch, driving the strays before them, Franklin had made a decision. Whatever attraction he might feel toward Willow Dawson, he would keep it firmly in check. In less than a week, he would leave on the cattle drive and afterward move on, as he always did. Getting involved with the boss's daughter, no matter how intriguing she might be, could only lead to complications he didn't need. That resolution lasted precisely 3 days. The night before the cattle drive was set to begin, James Dawson hosted a small gathering for the trail boss and senior hands. Franklin, having been appointed to lead one of the sections due to his experience, found himself included. The gathering was held in the ranch house parlor, where Willow played hostess, serving drinks and engaging the men in conversation with an ease that spoke of her comfort in this role. As the evening progressed, Franklin found himself gravitating toward a small bookshelf in the corner, examining the leather-bound volumes there. You like books? Willow's voice startled him. She had approached silently, carrying a tray with fresh drinks. When I can get them, Franklin admitted, though opportunities are limited on the trail. She set down her tray and pulled a volume from the shelf. This was my favorite as a girl. Cooper's The Prairie. Father read it to me before I could read myself. Their hands brushed as she passed him the book, and Franklin felt that same jolt of awareness he'd experienced in the line shack. This time he saw in her eyes that she felt it too. "Miss Willow," called one of the older hands from across the room, "tell these boys about the time you outshot your father at the county fair." Willow smiled apologetically at Franklin before rejoining the main group, leaving him holding the book and feeling strangely bereft. As the evening wound down and the men prepared to return to the bunkhouse for an early night, Franklin approached her to return the volume. "Keep it for the trail," she said, pressing it back into his hands. "It might make the evenings pass more pleasantly." "I couldn't," he protested. "It's clearly special to you." "Then you'll have to return it to me," she said, her eyes holding his, "when you come back." The implication was clear. She expected him to return after the drive rather than moving on. Before Franklin could respond, her father called her away, leaving him holding the book and wondering if he had misunderstood her meaning. That night, as the bunkhouse settled into the quiet rhythms of men preparing for an early departure, Franklin lay awake, the book beside him. He'd always planned to move on after this drive, as he had after countless others. Yet for the first time in years, the thought of leaving filled him not with the usual sense of freedom, but with an unfamiliar hollowness. Dawn came with a flurry of activity, as nearly 3,000 cattle were gathered for the drive north. Franklin found himself too busy with last-minute preparations to dwell on his conflicted feelings. It wasn't until they were ready to move out that he caught sight of Willow, standing on the porch of the main house beside her father as they bid farewell to the hands. As the procession passed the house, Dawson called out final instructions to the trail boss, while Willow's gaze seemed to search the riders until it found Franklin. When their eyes met, she raised a hand in a small wave that seemed meant for him alone. Franklin tipped his hat in acknowledgement, an unexpected warmth spreading through his chest despite the cool morning air. The first day on the trail passed in the familiar routine of dust, hoofbeats, and the constant vigilance required to keep the herd together. As evening approached and they made camp for the night, Franklin found himself reaching for the book Willow had lent him. Inside the cover, he discovered something he'd missed before, a small envelope with his name written in a delicate hand. Glancing around to ensure his privacy, Franklin opened it to find a brief note. "Franklin, safe travels on your journey. When you finish this book, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. I've always believed that sharing stories helps us understand not just the tales themselves, but each other as well. Perhaps when you return, we might discuss it over coffee somewhere more comfortable than a line shack during a thunderstorm. Until then, Willow." Franklin read the note 3 times, tracing her signature with his finger. The invitation was clear but respectful of his independence. She was offering an opening, not making demands. Something about her approach disarmed his usual wariness. That night, by the light of the campfire after his watch ended, Franklin began reading the book. Cooper's descriptions of the frontier landscape resonated with his own experiences, and he found himself wondering what aspects of the story had captured young Willow's imagination. The following morning, surprising himself, he tore a page from the small notebook he used to track his earnings and wrote a brief response. "Willow, thank you for the book. I've started reading it and understand why it captured your interest as a child. The prairie Cooper describes is familiar to me, though I've known it as both friend and enemy in my travels. I find myself curious about which character you most identified with and why this story stayed with you all these years. The coffee sounds appealing, though I can't promise I'll be as interesting a companion as a good book, Franklin." He tucked the note into his saddlebag, unsure what he intended to do with it. There was no way to send it from the trail, and by the time they returned, the moment would have passed. Still, the act of writing to her felt significant, an acknowledgement of a connection he'd been reluctant to recognize. As the cattle drive continued northward, Franklin established a routine. Each night, he would read a portion of the book, then write a short note to Willow about his impressions or questions raised by the story. Sometimes he would include observations about the journey itself, the colors of a particularly vivid sunset, the behavior of a young calf that reminded him of a story from his own childhood, or the tall tales exchanged around the campfire. He told himself it was merely a way to pass the time, that he would discard the notes upon their return. Yet each letter became more personal than the last, revealing thoughts he rarely shared and memories he'd long kept private. In writing to Willow, even in letters she might never see, Franklin found himself examining his long-held beliefs about attachment and vulnerability on the frontier. 2 weeks into the drive, disaster struck. A sudden thunderstorm spooked the herd, triggering a stampede that sent cattle crashing through the camp. In the chaos that followed, Franklin and several other hands worked desperately to regain control. It was dangerous work, horses and riders risking life and limb amid a sea of panicked 1,000-pound animals. Franklin had just turned a section of the herd when he spotted one of the younger hands, a boy barely 18, fall from his horse directly in the path of the oncoming cattle. Without hesitation, Franklin spurred his mount toward the fallen rider. He reached the boy just seconds before the lead steers would have trampled him, hauling him up across his saddle and veering sharply away. The maneuver saved the boy's life but cost Franklin his balance. He felt himself slipping as his horse stumbled on the uneven ground. The last thing he remembered was the hard impact of the earth rising to meet him and a searing pain in his leg before darkness claimed him. Franklin woke to excruciating pain and the low murmur of voices. He was lying in a tent, his right leg heavily bandaged and immobilized. "He's coming around," someone said, and then the trail boss's weathered face appeared above him. "How bad?" Franklin managed to ask through gritted teeth. "Bad enough," the man replied grimly. "Legs broken in 2 places. Doc Jenkins was with the settler group camped nearby, thank God. Said it as best he could, but you won't be riding anytime soon." The implications sank in slowly through the haze of pain. A broken leg meant the end of the drive for him. Worse, it meant weeks or even months of recovery, with no way to earn his keep. "The boy?" Franklin asked, remembering the young hand he'd rescued. "Tommy's fine, thanks to you." Not even a serious bruise. The trail boss placed a hand on Franklin's shoulder. "That was a brave thing you did, Reed. Damned foolish, but brave." The next day brought difficult decisions. The drive couldn't wait, the cattle needed to reach the railhead on schedule, and every hand was essential. The only option was to leave Franklin with a nearby settlement until he recovered enough to travel. "We're 2 days from Cooperville," the trail boss explained. "Small place, but they've got a doctor who visits regular. We can arrange for you to stay there until you're mended enough to make it back to the Diamond D." Franklin nodded, resigned to his fate. A letter was dispatched to the Diamond D explaining what had happened, along with Franklin's pay for the work he'd completed. The next morning, Franklin found himself loaded into a wagon bound for Cooperville, his belongings and Willow's book his only companions. Cooperville proved to be little more than a cluster of buildings serving the surrounding homesteads: a general store, a small church, a one-room schoolhouse, and a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Abernathy. It was to this last establishment that Franklin was delivered, with arrangements made for him to board there during his recovery. Mrs. Abernathy was a brisk, efficient woman in her 50s who showed Franklin to a small but clean room on the ground floor. "Dr. Peterson checks through town every Tuesday," she informed him. "Until then, I've had experience with broken bones. My late husband was a carpenter, with more enthusiasm than caution." The first weeks of recovery were a blur of pain, boredom, and frustration for Franklin. Used to an active life outdoors, he chafed at the confinement of his small room. His only diversions were finishing Willow's book and continuing his one-sided correspondence with her. His letters grew longer and more introspective as the days passed, filled with reflections on his solitary life and the beliefs that had shaped it. "Willow, I finished your book today. I find myself drawn to Natty Bumppo's independence, yet troubled by his isolation. Cooper seems to suggest that even the most self-sufficient man needs human connection, an idea I've resisted most of my life. My father died defending our home when I was 16. Since then, I've convinced myself that attachment to people or places is a weakness I can't afford on the frontier. Every death I've witnessed, every abandoned homestead I've passed has reinforced this belief. Yet lying here, incapacitated and dependent on strangers' kindness, I'm beginning to question this philosophy. Mrs. Abernathy brings me extra cornbread because it reminds her of her son who's mining in Colorado. The blacksmith's boy reads to me from old newspapers because he wants to practice his letters. Their kindnesses come with no obligation beyond basic human connection. I wonder now if I've mistaken independence for isolation all these years." Franklin sealed this letter with the others, storing them in his saddlebag with no real intention of sharing them. They had become more of a journal than correspondence, a way to process his thoughts during the long, empty hours of recovery. It was on a particularly frustrating day, when Franklin had tried to put weight on his healing leg against doctor's orders and suffered for his impatience, that the door to the boarding house opened to reveal an unexpected visitor. Miss Dawson has come all the way from the Diamond D to check on you, Mr. Reed, Mrs. Abernathy announced, ushering Willow into Franklin's small room. Franklin struggled to sit up straighter, acutely aware of his disheveled appearance and the humble surroundings. Willow stood in the doorway, dressed in a traveling outfit of deep blue that made her green eyes seem even brighter. For a moment, neither spoke, each taking in the sight of the other. "You look terrible," Willow finally said, though her smile softened the words. "Most people would lie to a man in my condition," Franklin replied, finding his voice. "I thought you preferred honesty to platitudes." She moved into the room, taking the chair beside his bed. "Though to be completely honest, you look better than I feared. When Father received word about the accident, the letter made it sound quite grave." "Just a broken leg," Franklin said, though the weeks of pain and immobility had been far from just anything. "I'm sorry about the cattle drive. I know the Diamond D was counting on those profits." "The drive continued without incident after your heroics," she assured him. "Father received a wire yesterday that they reached the railhead with minimal losses." She studied his face. "Tommy Harris's father personally thanked us for hiring such a brave hand. The boy apparently hasn't stopped talking about how you saved him." Franklin shrugged, uncomfortable with praise. "Anyone would have done the same." "We both know that's not true," Willow countered, "but I didn't travel all this way to argue about your modesty." She reached into her bag and withdrew a small package. "I brought you some books. I thought you might have finished the Cooper by now." Their fingers brushed as he accepted the package, and Franklin felt that now familiar jolt of awareness. "Thank you," he said, genuinely touched by her thoughtfulness. "But you shouldn't have made such a journey just for that." "Is it so hard to believe I might have been concerned?" Willow asked, a hint of challenge in her voice. "Or perhaps I simply wished to see for myself that you were recovering." Before Franklin could formulate a response, Mrs. Abernathy returned with tea and her prized currant scones. "You two catch up while I prepare the extra room for Miss Dawson," the older woman said cheerfully. "She'll be staying overnight before heading back tomorrow." When they were alone again, Franklin found himself uncharacteristically tongue-tied. Willow seemed to sense his discomfort and filled the silence with news from the ranch, which hands had stayed on after the drive, how the summer grazing was progressing, her father's plans for a new breeding program. "Father was quite impressed with your actions during the stampede," she told him. "He asked me to inform you that there's a place for you at the Diamond D when you're recovered, if you want it." "That's generous of him," Franklin said carefully. "But you hadn't planned to return," Willow finished for him, her perceptiveness catching him off guard. "You were going to move on after the drive, weren't you?" Franklin couldn't bring himself to lie to her. "That was my intention, yes." And now, her question hung between them, weighted with meaning beyond the simple words. Franklin looked at this remarkable young woman who had traveled days to bring him books and company, who had seen through his plans without judgment, who waited now for his answer with those clear green eyes that seemed to see more than he wanted to reveal. "Now I'm not certain," he admitted, the most honest answer he could give. A small smile curved Willow's lips. "Uncertainty can be the beginning of possibility, Franklin. Even if it's uncomfortable." That evening, Willow joined Franklin for dinner in his room, Mrs. Abernathy having declared him well enough for company, but not yet ready for the boarding house's communal table. They talked late into the night, their conversation ranging from books to cattle to their different experiences of frontier life. Franklin found himself laughing more than he had in years, drawn out of his habitual reserve by Willow's quick wit and genuine interest. When she finally rose to retire to her own room, she paused at the door. "I'm glad I came, Franklin, whatever you decide about returning to the Diamond D." "So am I," he replied, surprised by how deeply he meant it. After she left, Franklin reached for his notebook and wrote another letter, one he knew with certainty would remain unsent. "Willow, your visit has left me more confused than ever. For years I've believed that avoiding attachment was the wisest course on the frontier. Today, watching you leave my room, I realized that wisdom and happiness might be entirely different destinations. There's a line in Cooper's book that I keep returning to: the earth was created for all, but American exceptionalism has arrogated it to themselves. I've been thinking that perhaps I've done something similar with my life, claimed it so completely for myself that I've left no room for anyone else to share it. I don't know yet what that means for my future, but I'm beginning to believe it might look different than my past." The next morning brought gray skies and the threat of rain. Mrs. Abernathy fretted about Willow traveling in such weather, but the young woman was resolute. "Father expects me back, and I have responsibilities at the ranch," she explained as she prepared to depart. Besides, a little rain never hurt anyone. Franklin hobbled out to the porch on his crutches to see her off, ignoring Mrs. Abernathy's protests about damp air and his recovery. "You'll take care on the trail," he said as Willow mounted her horse. It wasn't quite a question, not quite a command. "Always do," she replied with a smile, "and you'll follow the doctor's instructions so that leg heals properly." "I'll try." Willow gathered her reins, then hesitated. "The offer stands, Franklin, about returning to the Diamond D." "I know," he said quietly, "thank you." She held his gaze a moment longer, as if searching for something, then nodded once before turning her horse toward the trail home. Franklin watched until she disappeared from view, an unfamiliar ache in his chest that had nothing to do with his injury. The weeks that followed were marked by gradual healing and deeper introspection for Franklin. He continued writing his letters to Willow, each one more revealing than the last. As his strength returned and he began taking short walks around Cooperville with the aid of a cane, he found himself engaging more with the small community. He helped the blacksmith with calculations for a large order, taught the man's son to play checkers, and even attended a Sunday service at the small church, something he hadn't done since leaving Texas. Dr. Peterson finally declared Franklin fit to travel, though he warned that the leg would never be quite as strong as before. "You'll always know when rain's coming," the doctor told him. "But you should be able to ride and work cattle with minimal trouble." That night Franklin sat in his room and wrote what he believed would be his final unsent letter. "Willow, the doctor has cleared me to travel. By the time you would read this, I will have made my decision about returning to the Diamond D whatever choice I make. I want you to know that these past months have changed me in ways I'm still discovering. I came to Montana believing that a man's strength lay in his self-reliance. I still believe that's partly true, but I've learned there's also strength in connection, in allowing others to matter, even with all the risk that entails. You once asked which character in Cooper's book I most identified with. I think I've been trying to be Natty Bumppo, believing that solitude was the price of freedom. But freedom without purpose or connection is just another kind of prison, one I built for myself after my father died. Thank you for the book, for your visit, and most of all, for making me question beliefs I've held for too long without examination. The next morning, Franklin settled his account with Mrs. Abernathy and packed his few belongings. His saddle and gear had been sent ahead with the cattle drive, but the trail boss had left his horse at the livery stable in Cooperville. The animal nickered in recognition as Franklin approached, seeming eager to be on the trail again after weeks of inactivity. As Franklin swung himself carefully into the saddle, testing how his healing leg would take the strain, Mrs. Abernathy appeared with a small package. "For the journey," she said, handing him what turned out to be sandwiches and a slice of her apple pie. "Go with God, Mr. Reed." Franklin thanked her, touched by the simple kindness. As he rode out of Cooperville, he realized how many such moments of connection he'd experienced during his recovery, small kindnesses freely given without expectation of return. The community had taken him in as one of their own, despite his temporary status. It was a type of belonging he'd forgotten was possible. The trail back toward the Diamond D would take several days, giving Franklin ample time to consider his decision. He'd received offers of work from several ranches whose hands had participated in the cattle drive and heard of his actions during the stampede. He could choose any direction from here, continue north to the Montana high country, head west toward the Washington Territory, or return to the Diamond D and whatever waited for him there. On the third day of travel, as the familiar outline of the Bridger Mountains appeared on the horizon, Franklin made his choice. He would return to the Diamond D, not because it was the easiest option or the most practical, but because for the first time in years, he wanted to see what might grow from the seeds of connection he'd discovered in himself. It was late afternoon when he crested the final hill overlooking the Diamond D. The ranch sprawled below him, looking much as it had when he'd left months before. Smoke rose from the main house chimney, cattle grazed in the near pastures, and hands moved about the corrals going about their evening chores. It struck Franklin suddenly that it looked like home, a thought that would have alarmed him not long ago but now felt strangely right. As he rode into the yard, several hands called out greetings. Word of his approach spread quickly, and soon Donovan emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. "Reed, the foreman acknowledged with a nod. Wasn't sure we'd see you back here. Neither was I, Franklin admitted, dismounting carefully. Leg giving you trouble. Less than it was. Doctor says it'll heal well enough for ranch work. Donovan nodded, his expression revealing nothing. Boss will want to know you're back. He's in the main house with Miss Willow. Franklin handed his horse off to a stable hand and made his way to the ranch house, suddenly uncertain of his reception. He'd sent no word ahead of his return, not wanting to commit himself until he was certain. Now standing on the porch preparing to knock, he wondered if he'd made the right choice. Before he could knock, the door swung open to reveal James Dawson himself. Thought I heard a commotion, the older man said, his sharp eyes taking in Franklin's appearance. Reed, you're looking better than reports suggested you might. Yes, sir, healing well. Come in then, Dawson said, stepping back. No sense in having this conversation on the porch. Franklin followed him into the study, a wood-paneled room lined with books and dominated by a large desk. Dawson gestured to a chair before taking his own seat behind the desk. I assume you're here about the job offer, Dawson began without preamble. Foreman position. Donovan's moving to his own spread next spring, needs someone to take over. Your experience qualifies you, and that business with the Stampede showed you've got the right instincts. He leaned forward. Pays good. Includes the use of the small cabin by the east pasture. It's not a decision to make lightly. Franklin was momentarily speechless. He'd expected to be offered his old position back, not promoted to foreman. I'm honored by the offer, Mr. Dawson, but I have to ask, why me? You have hands who have been with you for years. Dawson studied him for a long moment. Good question, right question. He leaned back in his chair. 3 reasons. First, you know cattle better than most men I've met. Second, you make decisions based on what needs doing, not what's easiest or safest for yourself. That business with young Tommy proved that. He paused. Third reason is more complicated. The door opened then and Willow entered carrying a tray with coffee. She stopped short at the sight of Franklin, her eyes widening. Franklin, she said, his name almost a whisper. You're back. Miss Dawson, he acknowledged, rising automatically despite the protest from his healing leg. Her father cleared his throat. Willow, Mr. Reed and I are discussing business. Of course, she replied, recovering her composure. She set the tray on the desk, but instead of leaving as her father clearly expected, she took a seat in the second chair. Don't mind me. Dawson gave his daughter an exasperated look that suggested this was not an uncommon occurrence. As I was saying, the third reason is more complicated. He fixed Franklin with a penetrating stare. My daughter seems to think you're a man of hidden depths, Reed. She spent the entire journey to Cooperville and back talking about your thoughts on Cooper's frontier novels and your unique perspective on ranch management. Franklin felt heat rise in his face and didn't dare look at Willow. Sir, I can assure you. Dawson waved away his protest. I'm not accusing you of anything improper. My daughter has her own mind and always has. His expression softened slightly. What interests me is that she sees something in you that matches what I saw during your brief time here. A man who thinks before he acts, but isn't afraid to act decisively when needed. That's rare, and it's exactly what I need in a foreman. Franklin considered his words carefully before responding. I appreciate your confidence, Mr. Dawson, and the opportunity. I'd like to accept the position, but there's something you should know first. He drew a deep breath. I've spent most of my adult life drifting from job to job, never staying in one place long. If you're looking for someone to commit to the Diamond D long-term, you should be aware that putting down roots doesn't come naturally to me. Yet here you are, Dawson observed, when you could have gone anywhere after your recovery. Yes, sir. Here I am. Dawson nodded as if Franklin had confirmed something important. The position is yours if you want it. Donovan will train you through the winter, hand over full responsibilities in the spring. He rose, indicating the conversation was concluding. Think it over, let me know by the end of the week. No need, sir, Franklin said, standing as well. I accept. Dawson extended his hand, which Franklin shook firmly. Welcome aboard then, Reed, officially. He glanced at his daughter. I'm sure Willow can answer any other questions you might have. I have matters to attend to in town. After her father left, Willow poured coffee for them both, her movements precise and controlled. Foreman, she said, handing Franklin a cup. That's quite a promotion for someone who wasn't sure he was coming back at all. I wasn't sure, he admitted, until I was on the trail. She studied him over the rim of her cup. What changed your mind? Franklin considered evading the question, but found he didn't want to, not with her. I realized I've been running for so long I'd forgotten what I was running toward. Or if I was running toward anything at all. He met her gaze directly. I'd like to find out what it feels like to stay somewhere long enough to see what grows. A smile slowly spread across Willow's face, lighting her eyes. I think that's the most I've ever heard you say at once, Franklin read. He couldn't help smiling in return. I've been practicing, in letters I never sent. Letters, she set down her cup, her expression curious. To whom? Franklin hesitated, then reached into his saddlebag and withdrew the stack of folded papers he'd carried with him from Cooperville. To you, he said simply, offering them to her. Though I never intended for you to read them. Willow accepted the letters with a look of wonder. All these during your recovery. It started with your book, he explained. You asked for my thoughts on it. Writing them down became a habit, then something more. He gestured to the letters. You don't have to read them. They're probably not very interesting. I disagree, she said, carefully tucking the letters into her pocket. I suspect they're extremely interesting, but I'll read them privately if you don't mind. Of course, Franklin agreed, relieved and nervous at the same time. Those letters contained thoughts and feelings he'd never voiced aloud to anyone. In the meantime, Willow continued, you should see the cabin. Father mentioned. It needs some work, but it's solid. We could ride out there tomorrow if your leg is up to it. I'd like that, Franklin said. The small cabin proved to be more substantial than Franklin had expected, 2 rooms with a stone fireplace, situated on a small rise overlooking a peaceful meadow. It needed repairs to the roof and one wall where water damage had occurred, but the structure was sound. This was the original homestead cabin, Willow explained as they walked through the empty rooms. Father built the main house after the ranch began to prosper, but he could never bring himself to tear this down. Says it reminds him of where he started. Franklin ran his hand along the rough-hewn log wall, feeling the history in the weathered wood. It's a good place, he said simply. Willow watched him move through the space. It needs furniture and curtains, and someone who appreciates its character. Are you offering to help with curtains, Miss Dawson? Franklin asked, a smile tugging at his lips. Perhaps, she replied with an answering smile, though I should warn you I'm better with ledger books than needle and thread. They spent the afternoon making plans for the cabin's restoration, Franklin noting repairs needed, while Willow sketched a rough layout for furniture placement. Their easy collaboration felt natural, as if they'd been working together for years rather than days. As they rode back to the main ranch in the golden light of late afternoon, Franklin found himself studying Willow's profile against the backdrop of mountains and sky. She belonged here in a way he never had anywhere, her confidence and grace a product of knowing exactly where and who she was in the world. You're staring, she observed without looking at him. Apologize, he said, not sounding particularly sorry. I was just thinking that you embody this place in a way few people ever connect with their surroundings. Willow turned to him then, her expression thoughtful. Is that a compliment or an observation? Both, I think. Franklin guided his horse around a rocky outcrop. My father used to say some people are born to their purpose, while others have to search for it. You seem to have always known yours. Not always, she admitted. When I was back east at school, I thought perhaps I should stay there. Become a teacher or a writer, live a more civilized life, as my instructors called it. She gestured to the landscape around them. But this called me home, not just the land or the ranch, but the purpose of it, building something that lasts, something that connects people to each other and to the land itself. Her words resonated with Franklin, touching on thoughts he'd explored in his letters. That's what I've been missing, he realized aloud, purpose beyond survival. Willow nodded, understanding without need for further explanation. It's not too late to find it, Franklin. That evening, Franklin moved his few belongings into the foreman's quarters in the bunkhouse, a small private room that would be his until the cabin was habitable. As he organized his meager possessions, there was a knock at the door. One of the younger hands stood there, looking uncomfortable. Miss Willow asked me to give you this, the boy said, handing over a small package before quickly retreating. Inside, Franklin found a folded note on top of what appeared to be a new journal, its leather cover unmarked except for his initials tooled into the bottom right corner. The note read simply, "For new beginnings and letters that might actually be delivered. I've read the first 3. May we discuss them over breakfast tomorrow? W." Franklin ran his fingers over the journal's smooth cover, a smile tugging at his lips. New beginnings indeed. Over the following weeks, Franklin settled into his role as foreman in training under Donovan's watchful eye. The work was demanding but satisfying, requiring both the physical skills he'd honed over years of ranch work and strategic thinking about cattle management and land use. In the evenings, he split his time between making repairs to the cabin and conversations with Willow that often stretched late into the night. These conversations began with discussions of his letters, which Willow was reading gradually, often responding with insights of her own about the nature of connection and purpose on the frontier. As autumn deepened toward winter, their talks expanded to include plans for the ranch's future, books they'd both read, and increasingly, personal hopes and dreams neither had shared widely before. "Father's considering buying the Peterson place," Willow mentioned one evening as they sat on the main house porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. "The water rights would secure our northern pasture, and the extra acreage would allow us to increase the herd significantly." "It's good land," Franklin agreed, "though the irrigation needs work before it'll support more cattle." "Exactly what I told Father," Willow said with a smile. "He's consulting with an engineer from Helena about diverting the creek." Franklin nodded, appreciating as always her practical understanding of ranch management. "Your father mentioned you've been handling more of the business decisions lately." "He's preparing me to take over eventually," Willow confirmed, though he has no intention of retiring anytime soon. She turned to look at Franklin directly. "It's unusual, I know. Most men would simply find their daughter a suitable husband to inherit." "Your father doesn't strike me as most men," Franklin observed, "and you certainly aren't most women." Willow laughed softly. "A diplomatic answer, Mr. Reed." "An honest one," he countered. "You know this ranch and its operations better than anyone except your father. Gender seems irrelevant to capability." Her expression softened. "That's a progressive view for a traditional cowboy." Franklin shrugged. "I've known enough capable women in my travels to question traditional limitations." He hesitated, then added, "My mother ran our Texas ranch for years before she died, teaching me everything from branding to bookkeeping. My father always said she was the smarter of the two of them when it came to business." Willow looked surprised. "You've never mentioned your mother before." "Haven't I?" Franklin realized she was right. "I suppose I think of them together, my parents. They were a team in everything." He stared out at the darkening landscape. "After my mother died of fever, something changed in my father. He kept working, kept teaching me, but it was as if part of him had gone with her. When he died defending our land, I almost felt he'd been half waiting for it to join her again." Willow reached out, her hand covering his on the porch railing. "That must have been difficult to understand as a boy." "It was," Franklin admitted. "I think that's when I started believing that loving someone that deeply was dangerous, that it left you vulnerable in ways I couldn't afford on the frontier." He turned his hand to clasp hers. "I'm beginning to reconsider that belief." Their eyes met in the fading light, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Before either could speak further, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention. A rider was approaching fast, his horse lathered despite the cool evening air. James Dawson emerged from the house as the rider pulled up to the porch. "Stevens," he acknowledged the man, "you're riding late." "Trouble, mister." "Dawson," Stevens replied grimly. "Rustlers hit the Carson place last night, took most of their herd and burned the barn when Carson tried to stop them. Carson's boy rode for help, but by the time the sheriff got there, the gang was long gone." Dawson's expression hardened. "Carson all right. Shot in the shoulder, but he'll live. Sheriff thinks it's the hardened gang moving back into the territory. Word is they're working their way through the smaller spreads before taking on the bigger ranches." "Appreciate the warning, Stevens. You riding on to warn the others?" Stevens nodded. "The Thompsons and Millers are next on my route. Sheriff's organizing a meeting in town tomorrow to discuss forming a posse if the territorial marshals don't show soon." After Stevens departed, Dawson turned to Franklin. Looks like your training's about to accelerate, Reed. I want extra men watching the herds, especially the north pastures near the Carson boundary. Work with Donovan to set up a rotation. Yes, sir, Franklin replied, already mentally calculating how to distribute the hands for maximum coverage. And Willow, Dawson continued, his voice softening slightly, I want you to stay close to the main house until this is resolved. To Franklin's surprise, Willow didn't protest this restriction. Instead, she nodded soberly. The Hardin gang doesn't leave witnesses, Father. We should warn all the outlying hands. The following days brought increased tension to the Diamond D men rode in pairs, even for routine tasks, and rifles accompanied every outing. News from town confirmed that the territorial marshal had been notified, but was tracking another gang near the Dakota border and wouldn't arrive for at least 2 weeks. Franklin threw himself into organizing the ranch's defenses, working closely with Donovan to ensure no section of the property went unwatched. The work was exhausting but necessary, and Franklin found unexpected satisfaction in protecting the Diamond D, not just as his employer, but as something that had begun to feel like home. A week after Stevens' warning, Franklin was riding the northern boundary with Charlie when they spotted fresh tracks crossing onto Diamond D land. Too many horses moving too purposefully to be travelers or neighboring hands. 8, maybe 10 riders, Charlie estimated, examining the tracks, heading toward the north pasture. Franklin nodded grimly. That's where the prime breeding stock is grazing. He checked his rifle. Ride back to the main house. Tell Donovan to bring men. I'll follow the tracks, see what we're dealing with. Shouldn't ride alone, Charlie protested. Boss's orders. We don't have time for both of us to go back, Franklin pointed out. I'll stay hidden, just scout their positions. No heroics. Charlie reluctantly agreed and galloped back toward the ranch, while Franklin followed the tracks at a more cautious pace. The trail led toward a stand of trees overlooking the north pasture, perfect cover for men planning to drive off cattle. Franklin dismounted a safe distance away and approached on foot, moving quietly through the underbrush. From his vantage point behind a large boulder, Franklin could see 8 men gathered at the edge of the trees. They were heavily armed, their horses tethered nearby, clearly preparing to raid the pasture where nearly 100 of the Diamond D's most valuable cattle grazed. Leading them was a tall man with a distinctive scar running from his left eye to his jaw, Jonas Hardin himself, if the descriptions were accurate. Franklin was considering his next move when a twig snapped behind him. Before he could turn, the cold metal of a gun barrel pressed against his neck. Well, a rough voice said. Looks like we missed one during our sweep. The man raised his voice. Jonas. Found us a spy. Franklin was marched at gunpoint to where Hardin waited, his hands raised and mind racing. The rustler leader studied him with cold eyes. Diamond D hand, Hardin observed, noting the brand on Franklin's horse visible in the distance. You Dawson's new foreman I've been hearing about, the hero from the cattle drive. Franklin remained silent, assessing his options and finding them severely limited. Hardin chuckled. Not talkative, are you? Doesn't matter. You won't be reporting back to Dawson. He gestured to 2 of his men. Tie him up. Once we've moved the herd, we'll leave him for Dawson to find. A message about what happens when people interfere with my business. Franklin was bound to a tree, his protests silenced by a gag. He watched helplessly as the rustlers prepared to drive off the Diamond D cattle. Their plan was clever. They'd created a gap in the fence line out of sight of the usual patrol routes and would drive the cattle through to waiting accomplices on the other side of the ridge. As the rustlers moved toward the pasture, Franklin worked desperately at his bonds. The rope was tight, but his captors had been hasty, and he found a small amount of give when he twisted his wrists a certain way. It was painful, slow work, the rough hemp scraping his skin raw as he maneuvered. The rustlers had just begun gathering the cattle when the sound of approaching riders echoed across the pasture. Franklin renewed his efforts, ignoring the pain as blood slicked his wrists. Through gaps in the trees, he could see Donovan leading at least a dozen Diamond D hands toward the rustlers. They'd arrived sooner than expected. Charlie must have ridden like the devil himself. What happened next unfolded with terrifying speed. The rustlers, realizing they were outnumbered, abandoned the cattle and took defensive positions among the rocks and trees. Gunfire erupted from both sides, the peaceful pasture transforming instantly into a battlefield. Franklin finally worked one hand free and quickly untied himself. Staying low, he retrieved his hidden rifle from where the rustlers had carelessly tossed it, then assessed the situation. The Diamond D hands had the advantage of numbers but were exposed in the open pasture. The rustlers, though fewer, had better cover among the rocks. Moving carefully through the trees, Franklin worked his way to a position flanking the rustlers. From here, he had a clear shot at several of them, including Hardin himself. Taking careful aim, he fired, striking one of the outlaws in the shoulder. The man fell with a cry, alerting the others to this new threat. Two of the rustlers turned their attention to Franklin, bullets splintering the trees around him as he ducked for cover. The diversion, however, allowed the Diamond D hands to advance. The gunfight intensified, both sides exchanging heavy fire. Franklin spotted Hardin breaking away from the main group, heading toward a secondary escape route. Without hesitation, Franklin pursued, keeping to cover when possible, but moving quickly to intercept the rustler leader. He caught up to Hardin at the edge of a small ravine. "That's far enough," Franklin called, his rifle trained on the outlaw's back. Hardin froze, then turned slowly, his own gun still in his holster. "Well, now you're full of surprises," he drawled. "Didn't expect you to be joining this dance." "Drop the gun belt," Franklin ordered, keeping his distance. "The territorial marshal will want to talk with you about the Carson place, among other things." A cold smile spread across Hardin's scarred face. "I don't think I'll be meeting any marshals today." With unexpected speed, he reached for his gun. Franklin fired first. His shot caught Hardin in the chest, sending the outlaw staggering backward. Even wounded, Hardin managed to draw and fire, his bullet grazing Franklin's left arm. Franklin's second shot hit Hardin squarely, and the rustler leader collapsed at the edge of the ravine. By the time Franklin made his way back to the main skirmish, it was largely over. 3 rustlers lay dead, 2 were wounded, and the rest had fled. 1 Diamond D hand had been killed, a young man named Peterson who'd only joined the ranch that spring, and 3 others had minor wounds. Donovan was organizing men to pursue the escaped rustlers when he spotted Franklin approaching. "Reed," the foreman acknowledged with grim satisfaction. "Charlie said they'd captured you." "They did," Franklin confirmed, wincing as he examined the bullet graze on his arm. "Didn't take much to their hospitality, though." "And Hardin won't be troubling any more ranches," Franklin said simply. "He's back by the ravine." Donovan nodded, then noticed Franklin's bloody wrists and arm. "Get those seen to back at the ranch. We'll handle the rest here." Franklin started to protest, then thought better of it. The adrenaline was fading, leaving him suddenly aware of just how close he'd come to not returning at all. As he mounted his horse for the ride back, a sobering thought struck him. For the first time in years, he had something to lose. Someone to come back to. The realization was both terrifying and strangely liberating. The main house was unusually quiet when Franklin arrived. One of the hands had ridden ahead to report the confrontation, so the household knew about the gunfight but not its outcome. As Franklin dismounted, wincing at the pain in his arm, the front door opened and Willow rushed out, her face pale with worry. She stopped short at the sight of him, taking in the blood-soaked sleeve and raw wrists. "You're hurt," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "Nothing serious," Franklin assured her, though he swayed slightly as a wave of exhaustion hit him. "Bullet just grazed me." "Others weren't so lucky." Willow moved to his side, supporting him as they walked toward the house. "Father rode out with the second group when we heard the shooting." "Who?" She couldn't finish the question. "Peterson didn't make it," Franklin said gently. 3 others wounded, but they'll recover, and 4 of Hardin's men won't be troubling anyone again." Inside, Willow led him to the kitchen, where she efficiently cleaned and bandaged his wounds. Her hands were gentle but sure, her focus absolute as she worked. Only when she had finished with his arm and moved on to his raw wrists did Franklin notice the tears she was blinking back. "I'm all right, Willow," he said softly. "Really." She looked up then, her green eyes bright with unshed tears. "When Charlie rode in and said they'd captured you, I thought," she drew a shaky breath, "I've read all your letters now, Franklin. Every word, and the thought that I might never get to tell you how they affected me, how they changed things for me too." She shook her head, unable to continue. Franklin reached out with his uninjured arm, his hand gently cupping her cheek. "I'm here," he said simply. "I came back." "This time," she whispered. The fear in her voice struck him deeply. It was the fear he'd carried for years, that caring for someone meant risking devastating loss. Yet seeing it reflected in her eyes made him realize something profound. The fear didn't diminish the caring. and avoiding connection didn't protect you from loss, it only guaranteed it. Willow, he began, then paused, searching for the right words. Today, when I was tied to that tree watching those rustlers prepare to steal your cattle, what bothered me most wasn't the danger to myself. It was knowing I might never see you again, never get to tell you. He hesitated. Tell me what, she prompted when he didn't continue. Franklin took a deep breath. That I've spent years believing the frontier was no place for putting down roots or opening your heart, that attachments were liabilities out here. He looked into her eyes. But these past months have shown me I was wrong. What makes life out here worth living isn't just surviving, it's building something that matters, and someone to build it with. Willow's expression softened. Is that a declaration, Franklin Reed? It's a beginning, he replied honestly. I can't promise I've completely overcome years of keeping people at arm's length, but I want to try, with you, he smiled slightly, if you're willing to be patient with a slow learner. Instead of answering with words, Willow leaned forward and pressed her lips gently to his. The kiss was brief but unmistakable in its meaning, a promise and an answer all at once. When she pulled back, there was a new certainty in her eyes. I think I can manage patience, she said with a small smile. After all, I've already invested considerable time reading your letters. The sound of men returning interrupted their moment. James Dawson strode into the kitchen, his expression grim until he saw Franklin. Relief flickered across his features, quickly masked by his usual reserve. Reed, he acknowledged. Donovan says we have you to thank for Hardin. I just happened to be in position, Franklin said. Any of your men would have done the same. Dawson snorted. False modesty doesn't suit you. His gaze shifted to his daughter, noting her hand still resting on Franklin's, then back to Franklin. Once you're patched up, I'd like a full report in my study. After Dawson left, Willow finished bandaging Franklin's wrists. He noticed, she said quietly. Does that worry you? Franklin asked. She considered the question. Not as much as it perhaps should. Father respects honesty above all else, and capability. She smiled slightly. You've demonstrated both today. The conversation with James Dawson that evening was more direct than Franklin had anticipated. After receiving his report on the rustlers, Dawson leaned back in his chair and fixed Franklin with an assessing stare. My daughter has feelings for you, he stated without preamble. Franklin didn't pretend misunderstanding. Yes, sir. And I for her. And what do you intend to do about that? Dawson's expression was unreadable. Court her properly, Franklin replied simply, with your permission. Dawson studied him for a long moment. Most men in your position would be calculating the advantages of marrying the owner's daughter. I'm not most men, Franklin said. And Willow deserves better than calculations. A slight smile tugged at the older man's lips. On that we agree. He leaned forward. I was wrong about you, Reed. When you first arrived, I took you for another drifter looking for temporary work before moving on. Now I find myself hoping you'll stay. He shook his head slightly. My daughter has never been one to make conventional choices, but in this case, I believe her judgment may be sound. Thank you, sir, Franklin said, genuinely touched by the unexpected approval. Don't thank me yet, Dawson warned, though without real heat. Caring for my daughter means caring for this ranch too. It's her future, her legacy. I won't see either of them neglected. I understand, Franklin assured him. The ranch is part of who she is. I wouldn't change that even if I could. Dawson nodded, apparently satisfied. Good, then you have my permission to court her. He stood, signaling the end of the conversation, and Reed. The cabin repairs become more urgent now. I suggest you prioritize them. The weeks following the Rustler confrontation brought significant changes to the Diamond D. With the Hardin gang eliminated, tension eased across the valley. The territorial marshal finally arrived to take custody of the surviving rustlers, commending the ranch for its handling of the situation. Peterson was buried in the small cemetery on a hill overlooking the main house, his sacrifice honored by every hand on the ranch. For Franklin, the period marked a time of transition, not just in his role as future foreman, but in his personal life as well. His courtship of Willow progressed with a blend of traditional propriety and the unique understanding they developed through his letters and their shared experiences. They rode together during her free hours, dined with her father in the evenings, and continued their long conversations about books, ranch management, and increasingly, their shared future. As winter approached, Franklin focused on making the cabin habitable. Willow often accompanied him there, offering suggestions on improvements and occasionally helping with the simpler repairs. Under their combined efforts, the small structure gradually transformed from an abandoned relic to a comfortable dwelling. "It needs a bookshelf here," Willow said one crisp November afternoon, indicating the wall beside the fireplace. "For your growing collection." Franklin glanced at the small stack of books on the rough table, volumes she'd given him or loaned from her father's library. "I'm not sure 3 books constitutes a collection," he observed with amusement. "It's a beginning," she replied, moving to stand beside him, "like many things." He drew her into his arms, still marveling at how natural it felt. "Speaking of beginnings," he said hesitantly, "I've been thinking about our future." Willow looked up at him expectantly. "Have you now?" Franklin nodded, suddenly nervous despite the certainty of his feelings. "I know we haven't been courting long by conventional standards. And I'm still learning how to open myself to the kind of connection I've avoided for years." He took a deep breath. "But I also know that what I feel for you isn't going to change or diminish with time. If anything, it grows stronger each day." "Franklin Raid," Willow said with mock severity, "are you working your way toward a proposal?" "Apparently not very efficiently," he admitted with a rueful smile. "What I'm trying to say is that I love you, Willow. I want to build a life with you here, to be part of what you're creating with the Diamond D, to face whatever the frontier brings together." Willow's expression softened. "That was much better," she murmured, reaching up to touch his face gently. "And yes, Franklin, I will marry you." He blinked in surprise. "I haven't actually asked yet." "I've never been particularly patient," she reminded him with a smile. "But if traditional forms matter to you, by all means, continue." Laughing, Franklin dropped to one knee, taking her hand in his. "Willow Dawson, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" "Yes," she said simply, her green eyes shining with certainty. "Nothing would make me happier." Their engagement was announced at Thanksgiving dinner, with James Dawson raising a toast to the future of the Diamond D and the young couple who would eventually guide its destiny. The hands celebrated with an impromptu dance in the barn, complete with fiddle music and a barrel of cider that ensured high spirits well into the night. As winter settled over the Montana territory, Franklin and Willow began planning their spring wedding. The cabin was completed just before the first heavy snowfall, providing Franklin with a space of his own while they awaited their marriage. He continued writing to Willow, though these letters were delivered rather than stored away, sometimes carried personally when the distance between the cabin and main house seemed too great, sometimes left for her to discover in unexpected places. These letters chronicled not only his growing love for her, but also his evolving relationship with the Diamond D and its people. He wrote of seeing the ranch through new eyes, not as temporary employment, but as a legacy to protect and enhance. He shared ideas for improving cattle bloodlines, for managing the expanding acreage, for building community among the neighboring ranches. And sometimes, when words of love came easier on paper than in person, he wrote simply of the joy she had brought into his life and his gratitude for the patience with which she helped him learn to open his heart. Willow kept every letter, often responding with notes of her own, practical sometimes, romantic others, always uniquely her. Their written exchanges became a private language between them, a way of sharing thoughts too tender or too complex for casual conversation. As winter gave way to spring and wedding preparations intensified, Franklin found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this point. The young man who had ridden into Silver Creek nearly a year before, determined to remain unattached and independent, seemed like a stranger now. That Franklin had believed the frontier too harsh for roots and connections. This Franklin understood that those very connections were what made the harshness bearable, even beautiful in its way. The wedding was set for the first Saturday in May, when the mountain meadows would be blanketed in wildflowers and the weather mild enough for an outdoor celebration. Guests would come from neighboring ranches and as far away as Helena, where Willow had friends from her school days. The ceremony would take place on the hill overlooking the ranch, followed by a feast and dancing that promised to be the social event of the season. As the day approached, Franklin found himself increasingly reflective. The night before the wedding, he sat in his cabin and wrote one final letter, a summation of his journey from solitary drifter to a man ready to build a life with the woman he loved. He sealed it carefully, this last letter, before they would begin their life together, and set it aside to give her on their wedding day. May 5, 1879 dawned clear and warm, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of pine and new grass across the Diamond D. By mid-morning, wagons and riders began arriving, the usually quiet ranch transforming into a bustling center of activity. Franklin spent the morning with Charlie and several other hands who had become friends over the months, their good-natured teasing doing little to calm his unexpected nerves. "Never thought I'd see the day," Charlie remarked as he helped Franklin with his new suit, the first he'd owned since leaving Texas. "The drifter and the boss's daughter, you've come a long way, Reed." Franklin smoothed the dark jacket, nodding in acknowledgement. "Further than I ever expected to travel, in ways that have nothing to do with miles." By early afternoon, everything was ready. Chairs had been arranged on the hillside facing the mountains, with an arbor of spring branches marking the spot where Franklin and Willow would exchange their vows. Reverend Thompson from the Silver Creek Church waited there, Bible in hand, as guests found their places. Franklin stood beneath the arbor, watching as the last guests arrived. Among them was Mrs. Abernathy from Cooperville, who had made the journey to see the cowboy she'd nursed back to health begin his new life. Franklin greeted her warmly, touched by her presence. "I knew you were special when you stayed with me," she told him with a knowing smile. "Not many men use their recovery time to read philosophy and write letters. I told my sister you were either unusually thoughtful or terribly love-struck. Seems I was right on both counts." Before Franklin could respond, the small group of musicians began playing, signaling the start of the ceremony. The assembled guests turned to watch as James Dawson appeared at the top of the path, Willow on his arm. Franklin's breath caught at the sight of her. Willow wore a gown of ivory silk, simple in design but elegant in its draping. Her wheat blonde hair was arranged in loose curls beneath a crown of wildflowers, and in her hands she carried not the traditional bouquet, but a small wooden box inlaid with mother-of-pearl. Her green eyes found Franklin's immediately, her smile radiant as she and her father began their walk toward the arbor. When they reached him, James placed Willow's hand in Franklin's with a nod of solemn approval before taking his seat in the front row. Franklin and Willow turned to face Reverend Thompson, their joined hands steady despite the significance of the moment. The ceremony itself was traditional, with vows that generations of couples had exchanged before them. Yet as Franklin spoke the familiar words, promising to love, honor, and cherish Willow for all the days of his life, they felt new, as if he were the first man to make such promises and mean them with every fiber of his being. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, the gathered crowd erupted in cheers. Franklin kissed his bride with a mixture of tenderness and barely contained joy that left them both breathless. As they turned to face their guests as husband and wife, the look they exchanged held the private knowledge that this was more than a wedding. It was the culmination of a journey neither had expected to make. The celebration that followed was everything a frontier wedding should be: abundant food, flowing drinks, music and dancing that continued well into the evening. Franklin found himself welcomed into the extended community of ranchers and townspeople with genuine warmth, no longer viewed as a transient hand, but as a permanent part of the Diamond D and the valley's future. It was during a quiet moment between dances that Willow led Franklin away from the festivities to a small bench overlooking the ranch below. The setting sun painted the buildings and pastures in gold, the cattle mere shadows against the vibrant landscape. "I have something for you," she said, finally opening the wooden box she had carried throughout the day. Inside lay a stack of letters, all the ones Franklin had written to her during his recovery and the months of their courtship. "I've read them all," she told him, her voice soft with emotion. "Some many times over. They chart your journey from the man who believed he had to face the frontier alone to the man who stands beside me today." She touched his face gently. "I wanted to carry them with me today as a reminder of how far we've come, and how far we have yet to go together." Franklin was momentarily speechless, moved by the sentiment behind her gesture. "I have one more to add to your collection," he said finally, reaching into his jacket to retrieve the letter he'd written the night before. "Though perhaps we should read this one together." Willow accepted the letter and carefully broke the seal. As the sun dipped below the mountains, casting long shadows across their new life together, she began to read aloud. "My dearest Willow, as I write this on the eve of our wedding, I am struck by the remarkable journey that has brought us to this point. When I rode onto the Diamond D nearly a year ago, I was a man who believed the frontier was no place for putting down roots. That attachment was a luxury the harsh realities of this land would not permit. I had survived for years by keeping my distance, by refusing to allow anyone or any place to matter too much. It was a form of protection, I thought, against the inevitable losses that frontier life brings. What I didn't understand then was that in protecting myself, I had created a different kind of loss, the absence of connection, of purpose beyond mere survival, of the profound joy that comes from loving and being loved in return. You changed that, Willow, not all at once, but gradually, persistently, with the same quiet strength you bring to everything you do. Through your letters, your conversations, your unwavering belief that the frontier is not just a place of hardship, but of possibility, you helped me see that the very connections I feared were what made life here worthwhile. Tomorrow I will promise to love and cherish you for all the days of my life. It is a vow I make gladly, with full awareness of what it means. The frontier remains as unpredictable and sometimes dangerous as it was when I arrived, the land no more forgiving, the seasons no less extreme, the distance between settlements no shorter. But I face it differently now, not alone but with you beside me, not just surviving but building something that matters. I do not know what challenges our future holds. I only know that whatever comes, we will face it together. The roots we're putting down, in this land, in this community, in each other, will not make us more vulnerable but more resilient, able to withstand whatever storms may come because we do not stand alone. With all my love, today and always. Franklin. As Willow finished reading, her eyes shining with unshed tears, Franklin took her hands in his. "Thank you," he said simply, "for teaching me that even on the frontier, the heart can find its home." "And thank you," she replied, "for having the courage to learn that lesson." She leaned forward, resting her forehead against his. "Welcome home," Franklin read. Below them, the lights of the Diamond D twinkled on as evening deepened into night. Music and laughter drifted up from the celebration, a reminder of the community that now surrounded them. And as Franklin drew his bride into his arms for a kiss that held all the promise of their future together, he knew with absolute certainty that he had finally found where he belonged, not just on this land, but with this woman who had shown him that love, far from being a liability on the frontier, was its greatest strength.